On a stormy night, Jack Morgan, a reclusive, wealthy man, makes a decision that changes his life forever when he stops to help a young girl shivering in the rain. Emma, an orphan hardened by life on the streets, is hesitant to trust anyone, let alone a stranger offering her safety. Jack brings her into his grand but lonely mansion, an act of kindness that becomes the foundation for an extraordinary bond. But Emma's new life is far from simple. Haunted by the traumas of her past and the looming threat of Razor, a ruthless gang leader who once exploited her, Emma struggles to believe she truly deserves the comfort and security Jack offers. Meanwhile, Jack battles his own demons, the lingering grief of losing his son and the fear of opening his heart again. As Emma's presence begins to breathe life into Jack's cold home, the two find themselves tested by external threats and their own vulnerabilities. Razor's relentless pursuit of Emma threatens to shatter the fragile sanctuary they've built, forcing Jack to confront his limits as a protector. At the same time, Emma must decide if she has the courage to trust in Jack's promise of family and fight for the life she's always longed for. The city of Chicago hummed with life, its streets bustling with hurried steps and murmured conversations. Between the towering skyscrapers and the glow of neon signs, life moved forward with a pace that left little room for the unseen. Emma Caldwell, a 10-year-old girl with large, cautious brown eyes, was one of the unseens. She crouched in the shadows of an alley, her thin frame barely noticeable among the discarded crates and torn posters. Her tattered jacket hung loosely on her bony shoulders, its once bright pink fabric now faded to a murky gray. Her jeans, several sizes too big, were cinched at the waist with a piece of twine. Emma's shoes had long since given out, leaving her with layers of mismatched socks to protect her feet from the biting November cold. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the sounds of the city beyond the alley's walls. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them as raindrops began to fall, creating dark spots on the pavement. Her mother's voice, faint but clear in her memory, echoed in her mind. Always be kind, Emma. Even when it feels like the world has forgotten you, do not forget to be kind. The world had forgotten her, or so it seemed. It had been 2 years since her mother had passed away, leaving Emma to navigate the streets alone. She had tried shelters but found them crowded and harsh. The streets, though dangerous, were predictable. She had learned to survive, but surviving was not the same as living. Emma's stomach growled again, pulling her from her thoughts. Reaching in her pocket, she pulled out a small, half-eaten granola bar, her only food for the day. She considered taking a bite, but hesitated as she heard a muffled cough from nearby. Peering around the corner, Emma spotted an older man huddled against a brick wall. His gray beard was scraggly, and his hands trembled as he tried to adjust the thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Emma felt a pang of guilt. She had so little, but he seemed to have even less. Taking a deep breath, Emma stood and approached the man. Her heart raced as she stepped out of her hiding place, but she forced herself to speak. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, holding out the granola bar. "You can have this." The man looked up, his tired eyes widening in surprise. "Are you sure, kid?" he asked, his voice rough. Emma nodded, pressing the bar into his hands. "I'm sure," she said, stepping back quickly. The man's weathered face broke into a smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a good kid. Not many would do what you just did." Emma shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's nothing," she mumbled, retreating back into the shadows. The rain intensified, and Emma sought shelter beneath an overhang at the edge of the alley. She shivered, her thin layers offering little protection against the cold. As the city's lights reflected off the wet pavement, she felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle over her. The sound of a car engine approaching caught her attention. A sleek black sedan rolled slowly down the street, its headlights slicing through the rain. Emma instinctively pressed herself against the wall, hoping to remain unnoticed. But the car came to a stop just a few feet away, and the driver's side window rolled down. "Hey!" a man's voice called out, deep and even. "What are you doing out here?" Emma hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But her legs felt heavy, and the rain was too cold to bear any longer. She glanced at the man, taking in his sharp features and tailored suit. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to study her carefully. "I'm fine," Emma said quickly, wrapping her arms around herself. The man frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You're far from fine. You're soaked and shivering. Do you have somewhere to go?" Emma shook her head, too exhausted to lie. The man sighed, leaning his head back against the car's seat. "Get in," he said after a moment, his voice softening. "I'll take you somewhere safe." Emma's heart pounded. She had heard enough stories to know the dangers of trusting strangers. But something in the man's tone, firm yet gentle, made her pause. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes softened. "Because no one else seems to be. Look, I can call the police if you'd prefer, but I doubt they'll do much for you tonight. I'm offering you a warm car and a dry place to rest." After a long moment, Emma nodded. Her legs trembled as she stepped forward, and the man quickly opened the passenger door for her. The warmth of the car hit her like a wave, and she sank into the seat with a relieved sigh. "I'm Jack," the man said as he pulled back onto the road. "Emma," she replied, her voice small. "Nice to meet you, Emma," Jack said, glancing at her. "Let's get you out of the rain first. We'll figure out the rest later." Emma watched the city lights blur past through the rain-streaked window. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. Emma's eyelids grew heavy as the warmth of the car seeped into her frozen limbs. She didn't remember falling asleep, but the sound of the car engine shutting off stirred her awake. Blinking, she looked around. The rain had stopped, but a dense fog wrapped around the towering building before her. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its large iron gates and ornate stone facade spoke of wealth and power. "We're here," Jack said, stepping out of the car. Emma hesitated before opening the door, her mind racing. She felt out of place, her tattered clothes and smudged face a sharp contrast to the pristine driveway. As Jack walked toward the mansion, she followed, her steps hesitant. The heavy wooden door creaked open to reveal a grand foyer. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of a chandelier, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender. Emma's wide eyes darted around the space, taking in the spiral staircase, the towering windows, and the intricate artwork on the walls. "This is your house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack glanced back at her. "Yes," he replied simply, shrugging off his rain-soaked coat and hanging it neatly on a rack by the door. "It's huge," Emma said, still standing just inside the doorway, unsure she was allowed to step further. Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It is too big, really." He turned to her, his piercing blue eyes softening. "You don't need to stand there. Come in. Let's get you cleaned up and warm." Emma nodded slowly, following Jack as he led her through the house. Despite its beauty, the mansion felt cold. The quiet was almost oppressive, and every sound, her soft footsteps, the rustle of her jacket, seemed amplified. Jack opened a door to a cozy guest room. A plush bed with a quilted navy comforter dominated the space, and a small lamp on the nightstand cast a warm glow. "This will be your room for tonight," he said. Emma hesitated at the threshold. "Are you sure?" Jack frowned. "Yes, I'm sure. Why wouldn't I be?" "It's just," Emma trailed off, glancing at the pristine bed. "I don't want to mess anything up." Jack's expression softened. "You're not going to mess anything up. This house has too many rooms I never use. It's about time one of them served a purpose." Emma finally stepped inside, her fingers brushing the soft fabric of the bedspread. She turned back to Jack, unsure what to say. "There's a bathroom through that door," Jack said, gesturing. "Take a shower and put on these." He handed her a neatly folded set of clothes, sweatshirt and sweatpants that looked far too big for her. "They belong to my son." His voice caught slightly, and he cleared his throat. "They'll be more comfortable than what you're wearing." "Thank you," Emma said quietly, clutching the clothes to her chest. "I'll leave you to it," Jack said, stepping back toward the hallway. "If you need anything, just let me know." Emma nodded and watched as he closed the door behind him. She stood in the room for a moment, unsure how to proceed. The silence felt strange, almost too peaceful. In the bathroom, she turned on the shower and let the warm water run over her skin. The grime of the streets washed away, swirling down the drain. For the first time in a long time, she felt clean. When she stepped out, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The girl staring back looked different. Her tangled brown hair clung to her damp face, and her large eyes seemed brighter without the layer of dirt masking her features. Dressed in the oversized clothes, Emma climbed into the bed. The mattress was so soft it felt like a cloud beneath her. She pulled the comforter up to her chin and lay staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced. She didn't know why Jack had helped her or what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, she felt safe, and that was enough for now. Downstairs, Jack poured himself a glass of scotch and sat in the dimly lit study. He stared at the flames flickering in the fireplace, his mind swirling with thoughts he hadn't allowed himself to confront in years. The girl Emma reminded him of someone. Her cautious eyes and quiet demeanor mirrored the way his son, Ethan, had once looked at him after breaking a lamp in the study. But Ethan was gone now, and the house had been a silent mausoleum ever since. Jack swirled the scotch in his glass, trying to push the memories aside. He wasn't sure why he had stopped for Emma. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was loneliness. Or maybe he thought bitterly it was sheer stupidity. "What am I doing?" he muttered aloud, shaking his head. But when he remembered the way Emma's small frame had shivered in the rain, the way her wide eyes had darted around the car with both fear and hope, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Just one night, he said to himself. She'll be gone by tomorrow. But deep down, Jack wasn't sure he believed that. Emma woke to the sound of soft knocking on the door. She sat up, blinking against the sunlight streaming through the curtains. "Come in," she called, her voice still groggy. Jack stepped inside, holding a tray with toast, scrambled eggs, and a glass of orange juice. "Morning," he said, setting the tray on the nightstand. "Figured you might be hungry." Emma stared at the food, her stomach growling audibly. "You made this for me?" Jack chuckled. "I tried, but if it tastes terrible, feel free to blame the toaster." Emma smiled for the first time in days, the small gesture lighting up her face. "Thank you," she said, reaching for the toast. Jack sat in the armchair by the window, watching her eat. "How long have you been on your own, Emma?" he asked gently. Emma paused, her hands trembling slightly. 2 years, she admitted. "Ever since my mom," she trailed off, looking down at the tray. Jack's heart tightened. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Emma shrugged, trying to hide her pain. "It's okay. I'm used to it." Jack frowned. No child should ever have to get used to that kind of life. As Emma finished her breakfast, Jack decided. He wasn't sure how it would work or what it would mean, but he couldn't send her back to the streets. Not after seeing the flicker of life return to her eyes. "Emma," he said, leaning forward, "I know I said you could stay for one night, but if you need more time, you're welcome to stay here for a while." Emma looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" "Yes," Jack said firmly, "but there will be rules. We'll talk about them later." Emma nodded quickly, a glimmer of hope sparking in her chest. Jack stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "I'll be at work most of the day. Mrs. Hattie, the housekeeper, will be here if you need anything." "Okay," Emma said, clutching the edge of the comforter. Jack hesitated at the door. "And Emma?" "Yes, I'm glad you're here." With that, he left, leaving Emma staring after him, her heart both hopeful and uncertain. The house felt larger and quieter once Jack left for work. Emma stood at the edge of the guest room, her fingers brushing the quilt on the bed as if grounding herself in the reality of her new surroundings. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here, in this place of gleaming floors and towering ceilings. Her first instinct was to stay hidden, just as she had on the streets. If she stayed out of sight, she wouldn't risk angering Jack or breaking something. She wandered through the hallway, her sock-covered feet silent against the polished wood. The smell of something warm and savory drew her toward the kitchen. Pushing the door open, she found a stout woman with graying hair bustling around the stove. "You must be Emma," the woman said, her voice warm but firm. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned, her eyes scanning Emma's thin frame. Jack mentioned you'd be here. Emma nodded, shifting uncomfortably under the woman's gaze. I'm Mrs. Hattie, she said, setting down a tray of muffins. I run this place when Mr. Morgan's too busy with work, which is most of the time. Come, sit down. You look like you could use a proper meal. I already ate, Emma said quickly, though her stomach growled faintly at the sight of the muffins. Mrs. Hattie raised an eyebrow, but didn't press the issue. Suit yourself, she said, her tone light. But if you're hungry later, there's plenty to go around. Emma lingered in the doorway, unsure of what to do. She watched as Mrs. Hattie moved with practiced efficiency, humming softly as she prepared the rest of the kitchen for the day. There was a warmth to her that felt strangely comforting, though Emma wasn't ready to trust it yet. Do you like books? Mrs. Hattie asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Books? Emma repeated, caught off guard. Mrs. Hattie nodded. The library down the hall has more books than anyone could read in a lifetime. Might be a good place for you to pass the time. Emma hesitated, unsure if she was really allowed to explore the house, but something about Mrs. Hattie's tone made her believe she wouldn't mind. With a small nod, she murmured, "Thank you," and slipped out of the kitchen. The library was unlike anything Emma had ever seen. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books of every size and color. A tall ladder leaned against one of the shelves, and a large armchair sat in the corner by a window that overlooked the garden. Emma traced her fingers over the spines of the books, her heart fluttering with excitement. She hadn't held a book since her mother's well-worn copy of The Secret Garden, which she used to read aloud to Emma before bed. She pulled out a small, faded novel and curled up in the armchair. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to relax. When Jack returned that evening, he found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, peeling an apple under Mrs. Hattie's watchful eye. "How was your day?" he asked, setting his briefcase by the door. Emma shrugged. "It was fine," she said, avoiding his gaze. Mrs. Hattie shot Jack a knowing look. "She spent most of it in the library," she said, her tone gentle. "She's a quiet one, that's for sure." Jack smiled faintly, relieved that Emma seemed to be settling in, even if only a little. "Good. I'm glad you're making yourself at home." Emma's fingers tightened around the knife she was using. "I'm not. I don't want to cause trouble," she said quickly. Jack frowned, his expression softening. "You're not causing trouble," he said firmly. "This house is big enough for the both of us. I meant it when I said you could stay here." Emma nodded, though she didn't fully believe him. People always left eventually. She had learned that the hard way. Later that night, Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but her mind was loud. She thought about her mother, the warmth of her hugs, and the way her laughter used to fill their tiny apartment. "Always be kind, Emma," her mother had said on the day they planted a flower box on their windowsill. "Even when the world feels unkind to you." Emma rolled on her side, clutching the soft comforter tightly. She had tried to be kind, even when she was hungry and cold. She had shared her food, helped others when she could, and kept her mother's memory alive through small acts of compassion. But being kind hadn't saved her from the streets. It hadn't kept her safe. She closed her eyes, her heart aching with the familiar weight of loneliness. The next morning, Emma woke to find a small stack of books on the nightstand beside her bed. A note was tucked beneath the top book. "Thought you might enjoy these. Jack." Emma's chest tightened as she read the note. She traced her fingers over the handwritten words, feeling a warmth she couldn't quite name. She had never expected kindness from Jack. He was quiet and distant, his expressions often unreadable. But this small gesture, a stack of books, chosen just for her, felt like a crack in the walls she had built around herself. She carried the books to the library, settling in her favorite armchair by the window. As she opened the first book, she allowed herself a small, cautious smile. In the evenings, Jack began spending more time at home. He often found excuses to linger in the library, watching as Emma lost herself in a story. He marveled at how quickly she had adapted to the house's quiet rhythms, though he could see the guardedness in her eyes. One night, he found her in the study, carefully organizing the papers scattered across his desk. "You don't have to do that," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Emma froze, her hands hovering over a stack of folders. I thought it might help," she said nervously. Jack shook his head, smiling faintly. You don't need to earn your place here, Emma, he said gently. Emma bit her lip, her eyes darting to the floor. I just don't want to mess this up, she admitted softly. Jack's heart tightened. You're not going to mess this up, he said, his voice firm. I brought you here because I wanted to. You're not a burden, Emma. She nodded, though he could see the doubt lingering in her expression. In the days that followed, Jack began to notice small changes in Emma. She started asking questions about the house, the books, and even Jack's work. She helped Mrs. Hattie in the kitchen, always eager to keep busy. For Jack, these moments felt like tiny victories. He knew trust wasn't built overnight, but he was willing to wait. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Emma turned to him with a hesitant smile. Thank you, she said softly. For what? Jack asked, looking up from his laptop. For letting me stay, she said. Jack nodded, his expression warm. You're welcome, Emma. I'm glad you're here. For the first time in years, Emma began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. The days stretched into weeks, and Emma began to adjust to life in the mansion. The routines felt strange but comforting, like stepping into a world she never thought she belonged to. Jack's quiet but steady presence gave her a sense of stability she hadn't felt in years, though the gnawing fear of being sent away still lingered in her mind. One morning, Emma found Jack waiting for her in the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The sight was unusual. He was always busy with work by the time she came downstairs. Good morning, he said, offering her a faint smile. Good morning, she replied cautiously, sitting at the table. Mrs. Hattie placed a plate of pancakes in front of her, and Emma murmured a soft thank you before picking up her fork. Jack cleared his throat. Emma, I've been thinking it might be good for you to go back to school. Emma froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. School? She repeated, her voice small. Yes, Jack said, leaning forward slightly. There's a private school not far from here. It's small, and I think you'd do well there. Emma stared at her plate, her stomach tightening. The thought of being around other kids who would surely notice her patched-up shoes and second-hand backpack filled her with dread. Do I have to? She asked hesitantly. Jack sighed, sensing her apprehension. I know it's a big change, he said gently, but I think it's important. You're smart, Emma, and you deserve the chance to learn and make friends. You don't have to decide today, but I want you to think about it. Emma nodded, though her mind was already racing. A week later, Emma found herself standing in front of the tall gates of Willow Creek Academy, her new school. Her hands gripped the straps of her backpack tightly, and she tried to ignore the curious glances from the other students milling around. Jack crouched down beside her, his blue eyes steady. You'll be fine, he said. Just be yourself. Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. What if they don't like me? Jack's face softened. You're a kind, brave girl, Emma. If they don't see that, it's their loss. With that, he gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder and watched as she walked through the gates, her steps hesitant but determined. Emma's first few days at Willow Creek were harder than she had imagined. The other kids were friendly enough, but their polished appearances and casual conversations about vacations and hobbies made her feel like an outsider. In class, she struggled to keep up. Her time on the streets had left gaps in her education, and the teacher's fast-paced lessons made her feel like she was drowning. She tried to hide her frustration, but it showed in the way she avoided raising her hand or meeting anyone's eyes. At lunch, Emma sat alone, picking at the sandwich Jack had packed for her. The cafeteria buzzed with chatter and laughter, but she felt invisible. On her third day, as Emma sat beneath a tree in the schoolyard during recess, a quiet voice broke through her solitude. Do you like to draw? Emma looked up to see a girl about her age with curly red hair and freckles. She was holding a sketchbook, her green eyes warm and curious. A little, Emma replied cautiously. The girl smiled and sat down beside her, opening her sketchbook to a page filled with intricate pencil drawings of animals and landscapes. I'm Sarah, she said. What's your name? Emma, she said, glancing at the sketches. These are really good. Thanks, Sarah said, her cheeks reddening. Do you want to try? Emma hesitated, then nodded. Sarah handed her a pencil and an empty page, and Emma began to draw. She wasn't as skilled as Sarah, But as the lines on the paper came together to form a small flower, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in days. "You're pretty good," Sarah said, grinning. Emma smiled shyly. "Thanks." From that day on, Sarah became Emma's first friend. They spent recess sketching together under the tree, and Sarah's quiet encouragement helped Emma feel less alone. At home, Jack noticed Emma's quiet frustration and decided to act. He hired a tutor, a kind woman named Mrs. Carson, to help Emma catch up on her schoolwork. The lessons were challenging, but Mrs. Carson's patient teaching style made them manageable. "You're doing great, Emma," Mrs. Carson said one evening after a particularly tough math lesson. "You've been through a lot, but you're a fast learner. Don't give up." Emma nodded, her cheeks flushing with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. Jack also tried to be more involved in her life. He began asking about her day at school, helping her with homework when he could, and even joining her and Mrs. Hattie for dinner, a rarity, given his usually hectic schedule. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Jack handed Emma a small wrapped package. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Open it," Jack said, smiling. Emma carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a set of colored pencils and a sketchbook. Her breath caught in her throat. "For me?" Jack nodded. "Mrs. Hattie mentioned that you like to draw. I thought you might enjoy these." Emma hugged the sketchbook to her chest, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she said softly. Over time, Emma began to find her footing. She grew more confident in class, raising her hand to answer questions even when she wasn't entirely sure of the answers. Sarah introduced her to a group of kind-hearted classmates, and Emma slowly started to feel like she belonged. Her drawings became a source of pride and comfort. One afternoon, her art teacher, Mr. Daniels, noticed her sketch of a sunflower and entered it into a school art competition. When Emma found out a week later that she had won first place, she couldn't believe it. "You did it!" Sarah exclaimed, throwing her arms around Emma. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time in years, she felt like she was good at something. That evening, Jack sat in his study, flipping through Emma's sketchbook. Each drawing told a story, some joyful, others tinged with sadness. As he studied the pages, he realized just how far Emma had come since the night he found her in the rain. "Maybe I'm not as terrible at this as I thought," he murmured to himself, a small smile tugging at his lips. Emma still had moments of doubt, times when she questioned if she truly belonged in Jack's world. But with each passing day, her fears grew quieter. She found strength in her new routines, her friendships, and Jack's quiet but unwavering support. One night, as Jack tucked her in, she looked up at him and asked, "Do you think my mom will be proud of me?" Jack knelt beside her bed, his blue eyes warm. "I know she would be," he said. "And so am I." Emma's heart swelled with emotion as she whispered, "Thank you, Jack, for everything." Jack smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to thank me, Emma. You've brought something to this house that I didn't even realize was missing." "What's that?" "Life," Jack said softly. "You've brought life back to this home." As Emma drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this new life, this family, could be real. The sun rose over the Morgan mansion, casting soft, golden light across the sprawling lawn. Inside, the house was slowly coming to life. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open in front of her. She was working on a drawing of the garden outside, trying to capture the way the sunlight hit the roses. Jack entered, sipping a cup of coffee. He paused for a moment, watching her. There was a peace in her face he hadn't seen before. "That's beautiful," he said, nodding toward the sketch. Emma looked up, startled. "Oh, thanks," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Jack set his coffee down and took a seat across from her. "Emma, I've been thinking," he began. Her pencil paused mid-stroke. "About what?" "About making this arrangement more permanent," he said carefully. "I want you to feel like this is your home. Not just for now, but for as long as you need." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She set the pencil down, her hands trembling slightly. "You mean you want me to stay?" Jack nodded, his blue eyes steady. "Yes, if that's what you want." Emma stared at him, her mind racing. She had always feared that this would end, that one day Jack would decide he'd had enough and send her away. But here he was, offering her a home, a real home. Her voice faltered. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything now, Jack said gently. Just think about it. Emma nodded, her chest tight with emotion. As the days went on, Emma began to see the mansion not as a temporary refuge, but as a place where she could belong. Jack encouraged her to personalize her room, and she spent hours carefully arranging the few belongings she had accumulated. Mrs. Hattie even helped her pick out new bedding and decorations, turning the once impersonal guest room into a space that felt like hers. One afternoon, as she was hanging up a drawing she had framed, Jack knocked on her door. Busy? He asked, stepping inside. Just finishing up, Emma said, turning to him with a smile. Jack glanced around the room, his expression softening. Looks great, he said. Emma hesitated before speaking. Jack! Yeah. Do you really think I can stay here? Like forever? Jack crouched down to meet her gaze. Emma, I wouldn't have offered if I didn't mean it, he said firmly. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Emma nodded, her throat tight. Thank you, she whispered. Emma's growing sense of security began to show in her school life as well. She started participating more in class, raising her hand to answer questions, and even volunteering to help with projects. Sarah remained her closest friend, and the two often spent their recesses drawing under their favorite tree. Emma found herself looking forward to school in a way she never had before. One day, Mr. Daniels, her art teacher, approached her after class. Emma, can I talk to you for a moment? She nodded nervously, clutching her sketchbook. I've been impressed with your work, he said. You have a natural talent for capturing emotion in your drawings. Emma blushed, unsure of what to say. There's an art exhibit coming up, Mr. Daniels continued. It's a showcase for student artists in the area. I think you should submit something. Me? Emma asked, her voice rising in surprise. Yes, you, he said with a smile. You got something special, Emma. I think other people should see it too. Emma hesitated, her mind racing. I don't know if I'm good enough, she said finally. You are, Mr. Daniels said firmly. Think about it, okay? Emma nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her. That evening, Emma told Jack about the exhibit over dinner. He set down his fork and looked at her with interest. That's amazing, he said. Are you going to do it? I don't know, Emma admitted. What if people don't like my work? Jack leaned forward, his expression serious. Emma, you've been through more in 10 years than most people go through in a lifetime. You've faced things that would break a lot of adults. If you can do that, you can handle showing your art to a few strangers. Emma smiled despite herself. I'll think about it. You'll do great, Jack said confidently. With Jack and Sarah's encouragement, Emma decided to submit her sunflower drawing to the exhibit. The process was nerve-wracking, selecting the piece, framing it, and writing a short description to accompany it. On the day of the exhibit, Jack dressed in a suit and tie, looking every bit the proud guardian. Emma, wearing a simple dress that Mrs. Hattie had helped her pick out, stood nervously by her artwork as people wandered through the gallery. See? I told you it was amazing, Sarah said, standing beside her. Emma smiled, though her hands were still trembling. When the judges announced the winners, Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Her name was called for first place, and she froze in disbelief. Go on, Jack said, nudging her forward. Emma walked to the front of the gallery, her cheeks burning as she accepted the certificate. The applause felt surreal, like it was meant for someone else. As she returned to her place beside Jack, he leaned down and whispered, I'm so proud of you. That night, as Emma sat on her bed with the certificate in her hands, she felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't known in years. She thought about her mother, about the nights they had spent reading and drawing together. I hope you'd be proud too, Mom, she whispered. Jack watched Emma from the doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. He had seen her grow so much in the past weeks, her confidence, her joy, even her laughter. She had brought something to his life he hadn't realized he was missing. Later that evening, as he sat in his study, he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a silver necklace with a delicate charm, a tiny sunflower, crafted with intricate detail. She deserves this, he murmured to himself. The next morning, Jack handed Emma the box. She opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she saw the necklace. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. "It reminded me of your drawing," Jack said. "And of you. Resilient, bright, unforgettable." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," Jack said, fastening the necklace around her neck. "I want you to remember this, Emma. You belong here. No matter what." Emma nodded, her hand resting on the sunflower charm. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she truly belonged. Emma's life was beginning to settle into a rhythm. School became less intimidating. Her friendship with Sarah grew stronger, and Jack's unwavering support made the mansion feel more like a home. For the first time in years, Emma felt like she had found solid ground beneath her feet. But the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. Emma and Sarah were walking home from school, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. The streets were quieter than usual, the breeze scattering leaves across the sidewalk. "I still can't believe you won first place," Sarah said, nudging Emma playfully. Emma smiled shyly. "I still can't believe I entered." They were nearing the mansion when Emma's breath caught in her throat. Parked at the curb, a sleek black car idled, its windows tinted so dark they reflected the gray sky. The driver's side window rolled down, and a face she hoped to never see again appeared. Well, the man drawled, his voice as rough as gravel. "If it isn't little Emma Caldwell." Emma froze, her heart pounding. She knew that voice, knew that face. Razor, the man who ran the street gang she had narrowly escaped months ago. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stepped in front of Sarah protectively. Razor grinned, showing crooked teeth. "Relax, kid. Just wanted to check in. Looks like you've moved up in the world." He nodded toward the mansion in the distance. Emma clenched her fists, willing her voice to be steady. "Leave me alone." Razor's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, Emma. You don't want to forget where you came from. Just remember, you owe me. Don't think you can hide behind your fancy new life forever." Before Emma could respond, a sharp whistle echoed down the street. A police cruiser turned the corner, its lights flashing briefly. Razor cursed under his breath, rolling up the window and speeding off. "Who was that?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern. Emma forced a shaky smile. "No one important," she said, though her hands were trembling. "Let's just go." That evening, Emma sat in the library, her knees pulled to her chest. The encounter with Razor had shaken her, bringing back memories she'd tried to bury. She had thought she'd left that life behind, but now it seemed closer than ever. Jack found her there, his brow furrowing as he took in her hunched posture. "Emma, what's wrong?" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Jack had been nothing but kind to her, and she didn't want to ruin the fragile happiness they'd built. But she also knew she couldn't keep this a secret any longer. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack pulled a chair closer, his expression calm but attentive. "Go on," he said gently. Emma told him everything about her time on the streets, the job she had been forced to do for Razor's gang, and the constant fear she had lived under. When she finished, her hands were shaking, and tears pricked the corners of her eyes. Jack was silent for a moment, his jaw tight. Then he reached out and placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to face this alone anymore," he said firmly. Emma looked up, her eyes wide. "But what if he comes after me? After us?" Jack's eyes hardened. "Let him try. You're safe here, Emma. I'll make sure of it." Jack wasted no time. The next morning, he hired additional security for the mansion and decided with the school to ensure Emma's safety. He also reached out to an old friend on the police force, explaining the situation. Emma watched all this with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "You don't have to do all this for me," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Yes, I do," Jack said, his voice steady. "Because you're part of my family now, and family protects each other." Emma's heart swelled at his words, but the shadow of Razor's threat still loomed over her. A week later, Jack received an unexpected visitor. Jason, a man from his past, had learned about Emma's situation through mutual acquaintances. Jason was a private investigator and had connections with organizations that helped at-risk youth. "I can help," Jason said, his tone professional. Jack hesitated, unsure of whether to trust him. But Emma's safety was his priority, so he agreed to let Jason investigate Razor and his gang. Emma met Jason over dinner that evening. She studied him carefully, unsure of what to make of this man with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor. "You don't have to be afraid," Jason said gently. "I'm here to help." Emma nodded, though her trust was not easily given. Jason's investigation revealed that Razor had been using Emma's name to intimidate other street kids, claiming that she still owed him money. The gang was expanding its influence, and Razor saw Emma's connection to Jack as an opportunity for leverage. When Jason shared this with Jack, his anger was palpable. "He's not getting anywhere near her," Jack said, his voice cold. Jason nodded. "Agreed, but we need to handle this carefully. If we push too hard, he might retaliate." Despite the precautions, Emma couldn't shake her fear. She often found herself looking over her shoulder, her heart racing at every shadow. But she also refused to let Razor's threats control her life. One afternoon, she sat with Sarah under their tree at school. "You've been quiet lately," Sarah said. Emma hesitated, then sighed. "There's just a lot going on." Sarah nodded, her green eyes understanding. "You don't have to talk about it. But if you ever need someone to listen, I'm here." Emma smiled, grateful for her friend's steady presence. The turning point came one evening when Razor left a threatening note on the mansion's gate. Emma found it before Jack did, her hands shaking as she read the words. Instead of panicking, she decided. She marched into the study, holding the note tightly. "Jack," she said, her voice firm. "We have to stop him. I'm tired of being afraid." Jack looked up, his expression softening. "We will, Emma," he said, "but we'll do it together." For the first time, Emma felt the weight of her fear begin to lift. With Jason's help, Jack worked to gather evidence against Razor's gang. The process was slow and painstaking, but progress was being made. Emma, meanwhile, threw herself into her art and her schoolwork. She refused to let her fear define her, determined to build the life she had always dreamed of. One evening, as she worked on a new drawing, she glanced at the sunflower necklace Jack had given her. It was a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. The days following the discovery of Razor's note were tense. Jack, with Jason's help, continued to build a case against the gang while increasing security around the mansion. Emma tried to stay focused on her schoolwork and her art, but the weight of fear lingered. Despite Jack's assurances, she couldn't shake the feeling that Razor's presence was a shadow creeping ever closer. One night, as Emma sat at the kitchen table with a math worksheet spread out before her, Jack joined her with a steaming mug of tea. "How's it going?" he asked, peering at the scribbles on her paper. Emma sighed, her pencil tapping against the table. "Not great. Math is hard." Jack chuckled softly. "I remember struggling with this stuff too. Want some help?" Emma hesitated, then nodded. Jack slid into the chair beside her, leaning over the worksheet. "Okay, let's take this one step at a time," he said. As they worked through the problems together, Emma felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. Jack's patience and quiet encouragement reminded her of the evenings she used to spend with her mother, reading by the dim light of their apartment. "You're really good at explaining this," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Jack shrugged. "I've had some practice. My son used to hate math too." Emma's pencil paused mid-stroke. "You never talk about him," she said carefully. Jack's expression shifted, his blue eyes clouding with something Emma couldn't quite place. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Ethan passed away a few years ago. He was about your age." Emma's heart tightened. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Jack smiled faintly. "Thank you. He was a great kid. Loved building things, Legos, model airplanes, you name it." The house felt quieter after he was gone. Emma didn't know what to say, so she simply placed her hand over Jack's. He glanced at her, his eyes softening. "You remind me of him sometimes," he said. "Not because you're the same, but because you've brought life back into this house. I didn't realize how much I needed that." Emma's throat tightened. "I needed it too," she admitted. The conversation marked a turning point for both of them. Jack began sharing more about Ethan, weaving memories of his son into their everyday conversations. For Emma, these stories painted a picture of a boy she wished she could have known and a family she was beginning to feel a part of. In turn, Emma found herself opening up more about her own past. She told Jack about her mother's love of gardening, how they used to plant flowers in old coffee cans on their apartment balcony. She used to say flowers are proof that beauty can grow anywhere, Emma said one afternoon as they walked through the mansion's garden. She sounds like a wise woman, Jack replied. She was, Emma said, her voice tinged with sadness. I miss her a lot. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. She'd be proud of you, Emma. I know I am. Just as Emma began to feel more secure, a call from Jason disrupted their fragile peace. I've uncovered some troubling information, Jason said over the phone. Razor isn't just using Emma's name to intimidate kids. He's planning to make a move against you, Jack. He sees you as a threat. Jack's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of move? I don't know yet, but I'll find out. You need to be careful, Jason warned. Jack thanked him and hung up, his jaw tight. That evening, he sat Emma down in the living room. Emma, I need to talk to you about something, he began. Emma's heart sank at his serious tone. What's wrong? Razor might be planning something, Jack said carefully. But I don't want you to worry. I'm doing everything I can to keep you safe. Emma nodded, though her stomach churned with unease. What if he comes here? Then he'll have to get through me first, Jack said firmly. His words were meant to reassure her, but Emma couldn't ignore the flicker of fear in his eyes. A week later, the mansion's security was tested. Emma was sitting in the library, sketching, when she heard the sound of glass shattering. Her heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, her mind flashing to the warnings Jason had given. Emma, stay here, Mrs. Hattie called, rushing toward the source of the noise. But Emma couldn't stay still. Her instincts urged her to hide, but she also knew Jack was somewhere in the house. Gripping the sunflower necklace around her neck, she crept toward the hallway. She peeked around a corner to see Jack confronting Razor in the foyer. Two other men stood behind him, their faces partially obscured by shadows. You've got some nerve showing up here, Jack said, his voice cold. Just returning the favor, Razor sneered. You think you can take something that belongs to me and get away with it? She doesn't belong to anyone, Jack snapped. She's not your pawn. Razor's grin faded, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eyes. You're making a mistake, Morgan. Before Emma could process what was happening, Jason appeared in the doorway, flanked by two police officers. Into the line, Razor, Jason said, his voice steady. The tension in the room crackled like electricity as the officers stepped forward. Razor's men hesitated, their confidence faltering. Within moments, they were disarmed and handcuffed, their bravado replaced by cold glares. As the police escorted Razor and his men away, Emma emerged from her hiding spot, her legs trembling. Emma, Jack called, rushing to her side. He crouched down, placing his hands on her shoulders. Are you okay? Emma nodded, though tears streamed down her face. I was so scared, she admitted. Jack pulled her into a tight hug. It's over now, he said softly. You're safe. Jason approached, his expression serious but relieved. They won't be bothering you again, he said. Thank you, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. Emma looked up at Jason, her gratitude evident. Thank you, she echoed. In the days that followed, the mansion began to feel like a sanctuary again. Emma threw herself into her art, finding solace in the pages of her sketchbook. Jack, relieved that the immediate danger had passed, made a point of spending more time with her. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the sunset, Emma turned to Jack. Do you think I'll ever stop being afraid? She asked. Jack thought for a moment before answering. I think fear doesn't ever completely go away, he said. But courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about facing your fear anyway. And you, Emma, are one of the bravest people I know. Emma smiled, the weight on her chest feeling just a little lighter. Though the scars of her past remained, Emma began to see herself not as a victim, but as someone who had survived. She wasn't just the scared girl hiding in the rain anymore. She was someone who could stand tall, even in the face of fear. As she closed her sketchbook that night, she felt a new sense of determination. The past might have shaped her, but it didn't define her. The days after Razor's arrest were quieter, but the weight of the past still lingered in the air. Emma tried to focus on school and her art, but the confrontation had left her shaken. The sight of Jack standing firm in the face of danger had filled her with awe, but it also deepened her fear of losing him. Jack, for his part, was determined to help Emma heal. He knew the scars from her past wouldn't fade easily, but he wanted to show her that she was safe and loved. One Saturday morning, Jack entered the kitchen where Emma sat sketching. She was working on a drawing of the sunflower necklace he had given her, the delicate lines of the petals capturing its simple beauty. "Emma," he said, his tone light, "how do you feel about taking a little trip today?" Emma looked up, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "A trip? Where?" Jack grinned. "You'll see. Dress comfortably." Emma's curiosity was piqued, but she didn't press for details. She quickly changed into jeans and a sweater, pulling on her favorite sneakers before meeting Jack at the front door. The drive took them to the outskirts of the city, where Jack parked in front of a modest building with a weathered sign that read Bright Futures Youth Center. "What is this place?" Emma asked, stepping out of the car. "It's a shelter," Jack explained, "for kids who don't have anywhere else to go. I thought we could spend the day volunteering." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been inside a shelter since her mother had passed away. The memories of crowded rooms and weary faces threatened to resurface, but she pushed them aside, trusting Jack's judgment. Inside, the atmosphere was lively. Children of all ages played with donated toys, while volunteers served meals and read stories. Emma hesitated at the doorway, unsure of where she fit in. A staff member approached, her warm smile putting Emma at ease. "You must be Emma," she said, glancing at Jack. "Jack told us you'd be coming. We're so glad to have you here." Emma nodded shyly. As the day unfolded, Emma found herself drawn to the art corner, where a small group of children were coloring and painting. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside a boy who looked no older than 6. "What are you working on?" she asked softly. The boy held up a crayon drawing of a house. "It's my house," he said, "the one I'm going to have someday." Emma's chest tightened. She knew what it was like to dream of a home that felt safe. "It's a great house," she said, picking up a crayon. The boy smiled, and soon the other children were showing her their drawings. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a sense of purpose. Across the room, Jack watched her with quiet pride. Later that afternoon, Emma and Jack helped serve lunch. As they worked side by side, Emma glanced at him. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. Jack paused, considering his words. "I thought it might help," he said. "I know what you've been through hasn't been easy, and I thought maybe seeing how far you've come would remind you of your strength." Emma looked around the room, taking in the laughter and chatter. "It does," she admitted, "but it also makes me want to do more. I want to help." Jack smiled. "You already are." As the weeks passed, Emma and Jack made volunteering at the shelter a regular part of their routine. Emma found joy in teaching the younger children how to draw, sharing her love of art in a way that felt meaningful. Her confidence grew with each visit, and she began to see herself not just as a survivor, but as someone who could make a difference. One afternoon, as Emma was helping a group of children create a mural for the shelter's wall, a staff member approached her with a request. "Emma," she said, "we're holding an art auction to raise funds for the center. Would you be willing to contribute one of your pieces?" Emma hesitated. The idea of putting her work on display for strangers was intimidating, but she also felt a tug of responsibility. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. Over the next few weeks, Emma poured her heart into a new piece for the auction. It was a painting of a sunflower field, the blooms stretching toward the sky in a riot of gold and green. She worked on it late into the evenings, Jack often sitting nearby to offer encouragement. "It's beautiful," he said one night, watching as she added the final touches. Emma stepped back, studying the painting. "I hope it's enough," she said quietly. "It's more than enough," Jack said firmly. The evening of the auction arrived, and the shelter's community hall was filled with supporters. Emma stood beside her painting, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Jack stood behind her, a steady presence that eased her nerves. When the bidding for her painting began, Emma held her breath. The room fell silent as bids were placed, and her heart raced with each one. Finally, the painting was sold for a sum far beyond what she had expected. The applause that followed felt surreal, But it was the pride in Jack's eyes that mattered most. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't known before. That night, as they drove home, Emma looked out the window, her thoughts racing. The auction had been about more than just raising money. It had been a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she could go. "Jack," she said softly. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for believing in me." Jack glanced at her, his expression warm. "You've always been worth believing in, Emma." For the first time, Emma truly believed it too. The weeks following the auction felt like a new chapter for Emma. For the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of belonging not just in Jack's house, but in her life. The shelter became a second home. Her art a way to connect with others and express feelings she couldn't put into words. Jack's unwavering support gave her the confidence to dream beyond survival, to imagine a future that was full of possibility. But growth is never without its challenges, and even as Emma blossomed, there were still walls she hadn't realized she'd built. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Jack brought up something Emma had avoided for months. They were sitting in the garden, Emma sketching while Jack read the newspaper. The peaceful moment was interrupted when Jack set the paper down and cleared his throat. "Emma," he said gently, "can we talk about something important?" Emma's pencil paused on the page. "Sure," she said, though her tone was hesitant. Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking, I'd like to make this official. I want to adopt you." Emma's heart stopped. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, her thoughts racing in a whirlwind of emotions: joy, fear, disbelief. "Adopt me," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Jack said firmly. "You're already family to me, Emma. This would just make it legal." "Permanent." Emma's grip tightened on her pencil. What if it doesn't work out?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Emma's eyes darted to the ground. "What if you change your mind? What if you decide I'm too much trouble?" Jack's heart ached at her words. He moved to sit beside her, his tone steady but filled with emotion. "Emma, listen to me. That's not going to happen. I've seen you at your strongest and your most vulnerable, and I'm not going anywhere. I want this because I believe in us. You deserve a family that won't let you down." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but she shook her head. "I don't know if I can trust that," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Jack nodded, his expression understanding. "Take your time," he said softly. "You don't have to decide right now. Just know that I'm here. Always." Over the next few days, Jack's words weighed heavily on Emma's mind. She couldn't deny how much she wanted to be part of his family, but the fear of abandonment loomed large. Her past had taught her that love was fragile, trust even more so. She threw herself into her art, trying to drown out the doubts swirling in her mind. But the sketches that filled her notebook were darker than usual: stormy skies, broken branches, lonely figures. "Those are different from your usual work," Sarah commented one afternoon as they sat under their favorite tree at school. Emma shrugged, her pencil moving aimlessly across the page. Sarah studied her for a moment before speaking. "You know, it's okay to be scared," she said, "but you can't let it stop you from letting people in." Emma frowned. "How do you know I'm scared?" Sarah smiled gently. "Because I was too when my parents got divorced. I thought if I got close to anyone, they'd just leave. But not everyone will." Emma's eyes stung with unshed tears, but she nodded. That night, unable to sleep, Emma sat at her desk and pulled out a piece of paper. She hadn't written anything in years, but the words came easily as she addressed the one person she missed most. "Dear Mom, I found a place to call home. It's different from what we had, but it's good. Jack is kind, and he makes me feel safe. For the first time, I'm starting to believe that maybe I can have a future. But I'm scared. I don't know if I'm strong enough to trust that this is real, to believe that it won't all fall apart. I wish you were here to tell me what to do. I miss you so much, but I hope you're proud of me. I'm trying to be brave, just like you taught me. Love, Emma." Folding the letter, Emma placed it in the drawer of her desk. She didn't need to send it. Just writing it down made her feel lighter. The following morning, Emma found Jack in the library, sipping his coffee as he read. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching the sunflower necklace around her neck. "Jack," she said softly. He looked up, his expression warm. "Good morning, Emma. What's on your mind?" Emma stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I've been thinking about what you said. About adoption." Jack set his coffee down, his full attention on her. "I'm still scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I want to try. I want to be part of your family." Jack's eyes filled with emotion as he stood and pulled her into a hug. "You already are, Emma," he said, his voice thick. "This just makes it official." Emma closed her eyes, letting herself believe his words. The next few weeks were filled with paperwork and meetings, each step bringing them closer to making Emma's place in Jack's life permanent. Though the process was overwhelming at times, Jack was there to guide her through it, his steady presence a constant reassurance. Mrs. Hattie baked a cake the day the final papers were signed, her warm smile lighting up the kitchen. "Welcome to the family, officially," she said, hugging Emma tightly. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and relief. That evening, Jack and Emma sat in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. Jack handed her a small box, his expression thoughtful. "What's this?" Emma asked, opening the box to reveal a framed photo of her and Jack standing outside the mansion, the garden blooming behind them. "I thought it was time we had a family picture," Jack said. Emma's throat tightened as she looked at the photo. It wasn't just a picture, it was proof of how far she had come. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack smiled. "No, Emma. Thank you for letting me be your dad." The mansion was filled with a warmth Emma hadn't thought possible when she first arrived. As the autumn days turned into winter, the house was no longer a quiet, empty place, but a vibrant space filled with laughter, conversations, and the gentle hum of a life shared. For the first time in years, Emma felt like she truly belonged. The adoption papers had been signed, but the weight of the moment hadn't fully sunk in until one evening when Jack handed her a small envelope at the dinner table. "What's this?" Emma asked, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface. "Open it," Jack said, his eyes glinting with anticipation. Emma tore open the envelope carefully, pulling out a sleek card. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words printed there. "Emma Morgan. That's your official ID," Jack said softly. "Welcome to the family, Emma." The card felt heavy in her hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented: a new identity, a new life, a new home. She blinked back tears, clutching the card tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jack reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "You've earned this, Emma. This is where you belong." Winter brought with it the excitement of the holidays. For Emma, who had spent the past few years dreading the cold months on the streets, the season now felt like a celebration of everything she had gained. Mrs. Hattie insisted on decorating every inch of the mansion, transforming the house into a winter wonderland. Emma eagerly helped, her laughter filling the air as she strung garlands and placed ornaments on the massive Christmas tree in the living room. Jack watched her from a distance, a smile tugging at his lips. It was a side of Emma he hadn't seen before, joyful, carefree, and full of life. On Christmas morning, Emma woke to find a pile of gifts under the tree, each one wrapped with care. Among the books, art supplies, and cozy sweaters was a gift from Jack that made her eyes widen in surprise. It was a set of keys on a sunflower-shaped keychain. "What are these for?" she asked, holding them up. "They're your keys to the house," Jack said. "Because this is your home now." Emma's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. As the new year approached, Emma began to think about what the future might hold. For so long, her focus had been on survival, but now she had the chance to dream. One evening, she sat in the study with Jack, a blank canvas in front of her. "What are you working on?" Jack asked, peering over her shoulder. "I'm not sure yet," Emma said, chewing on the end of her pencil. "But I want it to be something that shows hope." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "Hope is a good theme. You've got plenty of it to share." Emma smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. Despite her new life, Emma never forgot the shelter that had been a turning point for her. On a snowy afternoon, She and Jack visited bright futures to deliver supplies and spend time with the children. "Emma!" A group of kids called out, running to greet her. She laughed, kneeling to hug them. The shelter's director approached with a warm smile. "You've become quite the role model around here," she said. Emma blushed. "I'm just happy to help," she said. As she helped the children with an art project, she realized how much she had changed. The girl who had once felt invisible now had the power to make others feel seen. On New Year's Eve, Emma presented Jack with a painting she had been working on in secret. It was a portrait of the mansion's garden, but with a twist, the blooms were bursting with vibrant colors, each petal painted with meticulous care. "This is for you," Emma said, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to him. Jack studied the painting, his eyes softening. "It's beautiful," he said. "But why the garden?" "Because that's where everything started," Emma said. "It's where I first started to feel like I belonged. And it's where I realized I wasn't alone anymore." Jack set the painting down carefully and pulled Emma into a hug. "You've brought more to this house than I ever could have imagined," he said. "Thank you for trusting me, for letting me be your dad." Emma rested her head against his chest, her heart full. "Thank you for giving me a home," she said. As the clock struck midnight, Emma stood by the window, watching the fireworks light up the sky. Jack stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Emma smiled. "About how far we've come, and how much more there is to look forward to." Jack nodded, his expression filled with pride. "The best is yet to come, Emma. I promise." As the fireworks painted the night with bursts of color, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And she knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Emma continued to grow, both in confidence and in spirit. She flourished at school, her art gaining recognition beyond the shelter and school walls. But more than that, she built a life filled with connection, love, and purpose. Jack, too, found a renewed sense of meaning. Emma had reminded him of what it meant to have family, to care deeply for someone, and to find joy in the little moments. The mansion, once a cold and lonely place, had become a home, a true home filled with laughter, warmth, and love. Emma had learned that family wasn't just about blood, it was about the people who stood by you, who believed in you, and who helped you become the best version of yourself. And for Jack and Emma, their journey together was proof that even the most broken hearts could find healing in the power of love. If Emma's story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel to enjoy more inspiring stories about resilience, kindness, and the power of human connection. Your support means the world to us, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories that celebrate the beauty of life's unexpected journeys. Don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts, whether you saw yourself in Emma, Jack, or even in their struggles and triumphs. We'd love to hear from you. Let's celebrate the power of storytelling together. Thank you for being part of our community, and remember, every act of love can make a difference.